The Universal Broadcasting Network had a problem. Not the usual kind of problem, like how to explain quantum entanglement to a species that still thought sticks were cutting-edge technology, or why their latest game show contestant had accidentally started a religious movement on a Tuesday. No, this was a proper problem. The kind that made executives wish they'd chosen literally any other career, including professional asteroid juggler or black hole taste tester. Their flagship program, Extreme Habitation Challenge, was dying. Not metaphorically dying, actually dying. Ratings had plummeted so catastrophically that even the show's own producers had stopped watching, which was saying something because one of them was the show's biggest fan, and also its only fan, and also a computer algorithm, with literally nothing else to do. The concept had seemed foolproof. Take volunteers from across the galaxy, drop them on increasingly dangerous planets, see who survives longest. Simple, entertaining, legally questionable in 83 star systems. But after 12 seasons, viewers had grown bored. Apparently, watching a Krelothian die from toxic spores for the 900th time lost its appeal somewhere around episode 412. Executive producer Velmora Chint, a being who looked like someone had tried to describe an octopus to an artist who'd never seen one and also hated their job, stared at the ratings display with all 7 of her eye stalks. The latest episode had been watched by exactly 3 people. One was her mother, one was a confused, elderly Graxian who thought he was watching a cooking show. The third viewer was later discovered to be a glitch in the system. "We need something new," she announced to the room, which was empty because her staff had all quit last Tuesday. "Something nobody has ever survived. Something so dangerous, so impossibly lethal that even watching it feels like a health hazard." The computer algorithm, whose name was either Brian or a 17-syllable mathematical equation, depending on who you asked, helpfully suggested Infernus 7. Velmora's eye stalks recoiled in horror. "Are you insane? Nobody survives Infernus 7. That's not entertainment. That's just murder with camera equipment." "Exactly," said Brian. "Or possibly the mathematical equation. Think of the drama, the tension, the inevitable horrible death that absolutely will occur. We could stretch it out over multiple episodes. The first episode could just be them arriving and immediately regretting every life choice that led them there. How many civilizations have tried colonizing Infernus 7? 3,849. And how many succeeded? None, although one group lasted almost 13 minutes, which is still the record. Velmora considered this. On one hand, this was the stupidest idea anyone had ever suggested, and she'd once greenlit a show about competitive asteroid licking. On the other hand, her contract had a clause that said she'd be fired if ratings didn't improve by next quarter. And the only job worse than executive producer of a failing reality show was being fired from executive producer of a failing reality show. "Fine," she said, with the air of someone making a decision they knew they'd regret but couldn't be bothered to care about anymore. "Put out a call for volunteers, but make it sound appealing. None of this certain death business. Call it a challenge. Make it sound like an opportunity." The advertisement that went out across the galaxy was a masterpiece of deceptive marketing. It promised adventure, excitement, and the chance to make history as humanity's first colony on a pristine, untouched world. It did not mention that the world was untouched because everything that touched it died immediately. It did not mention the acid rain, the carnivorous geology, or the fact that the planet's atmosphere had once been classified as a war crime by the Interstellar Geneva Convention equivalent. What it did mention was a prize pool of 50,000 galactic credits. Which brings us to Derek Pemberton. Derek Pemberton was 34 years old, possessed a degree in mechanical engineering that he'd stopped caring about approximately 6 years ago, and had spent the last decade of his life doing the one job that slowly murdered the soul of every human who touched it. Its support for a mid-sized marketing firm in Delaware. Every day, every single day, someone would call him because they couldn't figure out how to turn on their computer. Or they'd broken the printer again, for the 15th time this month, and every single time Derek would walk to their desk, press the power button they'd somehow missed despite it being the only button on the entire device, and smile politely while dying inside. He'd tried quitting 3 times, but the universe in its infinite wisdom and terrible sense of humor had conspired to make every other job he interviewed for somehow worse. The last position he'd applied for involved teaching people how to use Microsoft Excel, which was essentially his current job, but with the added horror of having to do it in groups. So when Derek saw the advertisement for Extreme Habitation Challenge pop up during one of his routine procrastination sessions, he did what any reasonable person slowly losing their grip on sanity would do. He applied. He didn't read the fine print. He didn't research the show. He didn't even watch a single episode. He saw pristine, untouched world and 50,000 credits and thought, well, it can't be worse than explaining to Gerald from accounting why his computer won't work when it's not plugged in. The application process was surprisingly simple. A questionnaire that asked things like, are you afraid of death? And how would you rate your survival instincts on a scale of 1 to 10? And do you have any next of kin we should notify? Derek answered, no, 7, and just my mother, but she's busy with her book club on Thursdays, respectively. He submitted the form and immediately forgot about it, because at that exact moment, Gerald from accounting called to say his mouse wasn't working, and could Derek come look at it? The mouse was upside down. 3 weeks later, Derek received a response. He'd been selected for an interview. This was fantastic news. He was going to get out of Delaware. He was going to have an adventure. He was going to do something with his life that didn't involve explaining basic technology to people who'd somehow survived 40 years without learning that computers need electricity. The interview took place via holographic projection, which was Derek's first clue that he'd perhaps stumbled into something more legitimate than he'd expected. His second clue was the interviewer, a floating jellyfish creature named Threndil, who spoke through a translation device that made everything sound vaguely condescending. So, Derek Pemberton, Threndil began, his tentacles undulating in what might have been excitement or possibly nausea. You've applied for our colonization program. Tell me, what makes you think you're qualified to survive on one of the most dangerous planets in known space? Derek blinked. I'm sorry, what? The challenge, the deadly challenge. What experience do you have with extreme survival situations? Said Derek, frantically trying to remember what the advertisement had actually said. I've been camping? Threndil's tentacles quivered. Camping? You've been camping? Yeah, like twice. Once in Boy Scouts, and once when my ex-girlfriend thought it would be romantic. It wasn't, for the record. There were mosquitoes, the size of quarters, and she broke up with me because I complained too much about the lack of bathrooms. There was a long pause. Threndil's tentacles had stopped moving entirely, which Derek was beginning to suspect meant either deep thought or a minor stroke. You understand, Threndil said slowly, that this isn't a camping trip, correct? This is a survival challenge on a Deathworld where everything, and I mean everything, is actively trying to kill you. Right, said Derek, nodding. Sure, but like, how bad can it be? I spent 2 years working customer service at a phone company. People used to call me at 3 a.m. to scream about their bills. I once had a guy threaten to find where I lived because his download speeds weren't fast enough. If I can survive that, I can probably survive whatever you're throwing at me. Threndil's tentacles began moving again, though now they seemed agitated. You're comparing customer service to a planet where the rain is made of acid. Have you met customers? Derek countered. I'd take acid rain over another conversation with Helen from the 3rd floor, who keeps clicking on obvious phishing emails and then gets mad at ME about it. Against all odds, this answer seemed to satisfy something in Threndil's alien psychology. Perhaps it was Derek's complete lack of understanding about what he was getting into. Perhaps it was his casual dismissal of horrors that had ended entire civilizations. Or perhaps Threndil was just tired and wanted to go home, and this was the 5th interview today, and Derek was at least more entertaining than the last candidate who'd cried for 30 minutes. "Fine," Threndil said, in a tone that suggested he'd given up on finding anyone remotely qualified. "You're hired. We'll send you the contracts and deployment information. Please read the liability waiver carefully. Especially Section 9, about dismemberment, and Section 15, about what happens if you get eaten by the local fauna." "Cool," said Derek, who would not read the liability waiver. "So when do I get the 50,000 credits?" "If you survive for 30 days. When I survive for 30 days. That's the spirit," Threndil said, with the enthusiasm of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. "Prepare for the adventure of a lifetime, which will probably be a very short lifetime, but still, adventure." The call ended. Derek sat in his apartment staring at the blank screen where Threndil's hologram had been, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Excitement. Real, genuine, actual excitement. He was going to space. He was going to colonize a planet. He was going to do something that mattered. His phone rang. It was Gerald from accounting. His computer wouldn't turn on. Derek quit his job the next morning. The preparation period was a blur of medical examinations, legal documents Derek didn't read, and training sessions he mostly ignored because the instructor kept talking about emergency protocols and what to do when the megafauna attack, and Derek was too busy being excited about finally leaving Delaware to pay attention to minor details like how not to die immediately. He was issued equipment. So much equipment. A portable habitat module that supposedly could withstand most atmospheric conditions, a water filtration system rated for moderately toxic environments, a food synthesizer that could theoretically turn organic matter into technically edible substances, a comprehensive medical kit that included instructions for performing surgery on yourself if necessary, which Derek thought was a bit pessimistic, but whatever. The night before launch, Derek's mother called. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, in that tone mothers use when they know you're making a terrible decision, but they're trying to be supportive anyway. "This seems dangerous, sweetie. Maybe you should just find a nice job at another company. I heard the library is hiring." "Mom," Derek said patiently, "I've spent 10 years fixing printers. 10 years. Do you know what that does to a person? I need this. I need to do something different. But space, especially space. Mom, I'm 34 years old, and I've never done anything interesting. This is my chance. I'm going to colonize a planet. How many people can say they've done that?" "Probably very few, dear, and there's likely a good reason for that." But Derek had made up his mind, and once Derek Pemberton made up his mind about something, which was rare, he committed to it with the same energy most people reserved for religious experiences or really good sandwiches. Launch day arrived with the kind of fanfare usually reserved for funerals. Velmora Chint was there, mostly to make sure Derek actually got on the ship, because they'd already spent the advertising budget promoting his heroic journey. A small camera crew recorded everything for the show's premiere episode. A handful of Universal Broadcasting Network employees stood around looking uncomfortable, as if attending an execution they'd been forced to help organize. Derek bounded up the shuttle ramp with genuine enthusiasm, waving at cameras like he was heading off to summer camp instead of almost certain death. He had no idea that the entire production crew had started a betting pool on how long he'd survive. Current favorite was less than 6 hours, with surprisingly good odds. The shuttle ride to Infernus 7 took 3 days, during which Derek discovered several things. First, space travel was incredibly boring. Second, the food synthesizer made everything taste like cardboard, had a baby with disappointment. Third, the ship's computer had been programmed to be helpful in the most annoying way possible. "Good morning, Derek," the computer chirped on day 2. "Did you know that Infernus 7 has an atmospheric composition that includes sulfur dioxide, methane, and trace amounts of a compound we've decided to call mystery death gas, because we're not entirely sure what it does, but it's probably bad." "That's great," Derek mumbled, trying to sleep. "Also, the planet's gravity fluctuates randomly. Sometimes it's Earth normal, sometimes it's twice that. Sometimes things just float for no reason. Isn't science exciting? Turn off." "I can't do that, Derek. My programming requires me to provide helpful information at all times. For instance, did you know that the survival rate for Infernus 7 colonization attempts is currently 0.000? Derek spent the rest of the flight with his pillow over his head. On day 3, Derek got his first look at Infernus 7 through the shuttle's viewport, and for the first time since this whole adventure began, he felt a small flutter of what might have been concern, but was probably just the space food disagreeing with him. The planet looked angry. That was the only word for it. It looked like God had designed a planet specifically to give the middle finger to anyone who thought they were tough. The atmosphere was a swirling mass of colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Poisonous greens, violent purples, and an orange that suggested the entire planet was perpetually on fire, which according to the ship's sensors it kind of was in certain regions. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said the ship's computer. "It looks like hell took a painting class." Fun fact, 32 different civilizations have called Infernus 7 hell in their respective languages, although the Crythaxians called it the place where hope goes to die screaming, which I think shows real poetic flair. The shuttle began its descent, and Derek felt his stomach attempt to relocate to somewhere safer, like literally anywhere else. The viewport showed clouds that roiled and churned like they were angry about something, possibly the fact that they existed at all. Lightning arced between them in patterns that looked less like weather and more like the planet was having a seizure. "Approaching landing site," announced the computer with inappropriate cheerfulness. "Please secure all loose items and assume the position for moderate to severe impact." "Moderate to severe? Don't worry. The shuttle is designed to withstand most crashes. Well, 60% of crashes. Okay, 50-50 odds. But that's basically a coin flip, and coin flips are fun." The shuttle hit the atmosphere and immediately began shaking like a paint mixer having an existential crisis. Derek gripped his seat so hard his knuckles turned white. Outside the viewport, the hull started glowing red from atmospheric friction, which Derek was pretty sure wasn't supposed to happen, but was happening anyway. "This is normal," the computer assured him. "Well, normal-ish. Actually, we've never successfully landed a shuttle on Infernus 7 before, but there's a first time for everything." "What?" "Oh, don't worry. Previous attempts failed because of the acid rain, or the electrical storms, or the carnivorous wind patterns, or that one time where the planet's crust just opened up and swallowed the shuttle whole. But we've made improvements since then." "Probably," Derek would have responded. But at that moment the shuttle hit something that might have been solid ground or might have been the planet punching them in the face. It was hard to tell. There was a tremendous crash, followed by several smaller crashes, followed by what sounded like expensive equipment breaking, followed by silence. Derek opened his eyes, which he didn't remember closing. He was alive. The shuttle was mostly intact. If mostly intact meant held together by hope and possibly duct tape. Through the viewport, he could see his new home for the next 30 days. Infernus 7 looked even worse from the ground. The landing site, which the pre-mission briefing had optimistically called relatively stable, looked like what would happen if a volcano and a hurricane had a baby, and that baby was very angry about being born. The ground was a cracked, blackened surface that occasionally glowed from underneath with an ominous red light. The sky was the color of a bruise that hadn't quite made up its mind what color it wanted to be. In the distance, something that might have been mountains or might have been the planet's way of flipping him off jutted up against the horizon. "Welcome to Infernus 7, said the computer. "Your habitat module will deploy shortly. Please exit the shuttle and try not to die immediately. The ratings would really suffer if you died in the first 5 minutes. Derek stood up on shaky legs, grabbed his supply pack and walked to the shuttle door. This was it. This was the moment. He was about to step onto an alien world where, according to literally everyone who knew anything about it, he would almost certainly die in horrible and creative ways. He pressed the door release button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. Still nothing. Computer, the door's not opening. Oh yes, that's because there's a slight problem. What kind of problem? The external sensors are detecting that the atmosphere outside is currently acidic enough to melt through your suit in approximately 45 seconds. We need to wait for the acid rain to pass. Derek stared at the door. How long will that take? According to weather patterns, anywhere from 10 minutes to 3 hours. Isn't nature fascinating? This, Derek decided, was going to be a long 30 days. He sat back down in the shuttle seat and waited. The rain, which he couldn't see but could hear, hammering against the hull with the sound of angry fists, continued its assault on anything that dared to exist outside. Derek watched through the viewport as the relatively stable ground slowly dissolved under the downpour, creating puddles of something that was definitely not water and probably not safe to touch. So, Derek said to the computer, because talking to artificial intelligence was better than sitting in silence, contemplating his life choices, tell me about the previous colonization attempts. Are you sure you want to know? It's pretty depressing. Hit me. Well, attempt number 1 was the Valorians. They lasted 9 minutes before their entire settlement was consumed by what we later discovered was carnivorous sand. Attempt number 2... Wait, carnivorous sand. Oh yes, Infernus 7 has lots of carnivorous things. Carnivorous plants, carnivorous fungi, carnivorous minerals, carnivorous weather patterns. How can weather be carnivorous? We're not entirely sure, but there was this one storm system that seemed to specifically target organic matter and, well, the details are classified because they're too disturbing for general audiences. Derek made a mental note to never, ever go outside during a storm. Anyway, the computer continued cheerfully. Attempt number 3 was the Colonize. They brought massive atmospheric processors and terraforming equipment, really thought they had it figured out. They lasted 11 minutes before the equipment gained sentience and tried to kill them. The equipment gained sentience. We're still not sure how that happened. Current theory is that there's something in the planet's electromagnetic field that can spontaneously create consciousness in sufficiently complex systems. Isn't that wild? That's terrifying, is what that is. Attempt number 4 was actually pretty interesting. The Jakar brought these enormous biodomes that were supposed to create a completely isolated environment. They lasted 23 hours, which was a record at the time. Unfortunately, something inside the biodome mutated and ate everyone. Derek was beginning to suspect that he had made what experts would call a huge mistake. The acid rain finally stopped after 90 minutes, during which Derek learned about 8 more colonization attempts, each more horrifying than the last. There was the one where the settlers all simultaneously lost their minds and walked into a carnivorous cave system singing show tunes. There was the one where the planet's fungal network apparently decided to try diplomacy by slowly converting all the colonists into mushrooms. There was the one that just said redacted in the files, with a note that read, "For the love of all that's holy, don't ask." "Okay," announced the computer. "Atmospheric toxicity levels have dropped to probably won't kill you instantly. You're clear to exit." Derek stood up, adjusted his supply pack and walked to the door again. This time, when he pressed the button, it opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Air rushed in that smelled like burnt metal and disappointment. He stepped onto the surface of Infernus 7 and immediately sank 3 inches into the ground. "Oh, right," said the computer. "Forgot to mention, the ground is sort of soggy after acid rain. Try not to step anywhere that looks like it might eat you." Derek looked down at his boots, which were already starting to smoke slightly from the residual acid. He looked up at the sky, which looked back at him with what he could only describe as malicious intent. He looked around at the landscape, which was somehow worse up close than it had been from the shuttle. "This is fine," he said out loud, trying to convince himself. "This is totally fine. It's just 30 days. I've had customer service calls that lasted longer than 30 days. I can do this." Thunder rumbled in the distance, despite there being no clouds. Something howled from somewhere that sounded both very far away and uncomfortably close. The ground beneath his feet made a squelching sound that organic matter should not make. Derek activated his habitat module deployment system. With a series of mechanical whirs and clicks that sounded far less confident than they should have, the module began to unfold from his supply pack. It was supposed to create a self-contained living space with temperature regulation, air filtration, and structural integrity sufficient to withstand most environmental hazards. The deployment took 6 minutes. For 5 minutes and 59 seconds, everything seemed to be working perfectly. Then, on the 6th minute, there was a sound like someone had dropped a wrench into a blender, and one entire wall of the habitat module just fell off. "Huh?" said Derek. "Oh my," said the computer, which was still broadcasting from the shuttle. "That's not supposed to happen. Although, given the planet's variable gravity and atmospheric composition, and the fact that your module was designed by the lowest bidder, I suppose it's not entirely surprising." Derek stared at his habitat module, which was now less a module and more a three-walled suggestion of safety. The missing wall had landed 10 feet away and was already starting to dissolve from contact with the ground. "Okay," Derek said, with the calm of a man who had moved beyond panic into a sort of transcendent acceptance. "Okay, this is fine. I'll just, improvise." He spent the next 3 hours attempting to repair the habitat using spare parts, duct tape, and increasingly creative profanity. The result looked like what would happen if a child built a fort out of cardboard boxes, but that child was also going through a rebellious phase and hated architecture. By the time he finished, night was falling. Derek had assumed that nighttime on Infernus 7 would be dark. This was incorrect. Nighttime on Infernus 7 was dark in the same way that a black hole is a bit dim. It wasn't just absence of light. It was the concept of light giving up and going home. But more concerning was that the darkness seemed to move. Derek watched from inside his barely functional habitat as shadows flowed across the ground, like liquid, pooling in places where shadows shouldn't pool, and occasionally rising up into shapes that suggested something with too many limbs and not enough sense of proper anatomy. "Computer," Derek said into his comm unit, "what are those?" "Which ones? The shadow creatures, the bioluminescent deathworms, or the thing that looks like it shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space?" "All of them?" "Oh well, the shadow creatures are probably harmless, probably. The deathworms are definitely not harmless, but they usually don't attack things bigger than themselves, usually. And the three-dimensional space thing is really interesting because according to our sensors it exists in approximately 5 dimensions simultaneously, and we're not sure how that's possible. But—" Derek turned off the comm unit. He sat in his broken habitat, surrounded by a planet that was actively hostile to the concept of life, and ate a meal from the food synthesizer that tasted like sadness mixed with artificial chicken flavor. Outside, something screamed. Then something else answered it. Then they started what sounded like a duet, which was actually worse than the screaming. Derek pulled out his personal log recorder, a device he'd been instructed to use for documenting the colonization experience. "Day 1, he said into the recorder. "Habitat is barely functional. Atmosphere is trying to kill me. Ground is trying to kill me. Sky is trying to kill me. Local fauna is definitely trying to kill me and might be singing about it. On the plus side, nobody has called me about their printer breaking. So overall, I'd rate this experience a solid 6 out of 10. He clicked off the recorder, lay down on the habitat's floor. which was uncomfortably hard and slightly warm for reasons he didn't want to think about, and tried to sleep. Somewhere in the distance, the planet made a sound like grinding metal mixed with organic screaming. Derek decided not to investigate and pulled his thin thermal blanket over his head. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start actually trying to survive. Tonight, he would just try not to think about how every single colonization attempt before him had ended in horrible death and/or mysterious conversion into fungus. He fell asleep to the sound of acid rain starting up again, drumming against what remained of his habitat's roof with the persistence of a telemarketer who refuses to accept that you're not interested. Day 2 began with Derek waking up to discover that something had tried to eat his boot during the night. The boot had survived barely, but now had teeth marks that suggested whatever had attempted the snack had multiple rows of teeth and possibly aspirations of becoming a dental nightmare. "What the hell?" Derek shouted at the boot, which did not respond because it was a boot. He got dressed, checked his supplies, which were mostly intact except for one food synthesizer cartridge that had mysteriously vanished, and stepped outside to assess his situation. The daylight on Infernus 7 was not so much light as it was angry yellow fog that made everything visible but also somehow worse. The landscape that had looked hostile yesterday now looked actively malicious, as if the planet had spent the night planning new ways to be terrible. Derek's first priority was water. The portable filtration system could theoretically purify anything into drinkable water, including toxic sludge, industrial waste, or liquid despair. He just needed to find a water source. He spotted what might have been a stream about 200 yards from his habitat. He walked toward it, carefully avoiding patches of ground that looked suspicious, which was basically all of the ground. Halfway there, the gravity suddenly doubled and Derek found himself face first in the dirt. "Seriously?" he yelled at the planet, which did not care. The gravity returned to normal after 30 seconds. Derek picked himself up, brushed off dirt that was trying to stick to him in ways dirt shouldn't stick, and continued to the stream. The stream was not water. It was something purple that moved upstream half the time and downstream the other half, apparently unable to make up its mind about basic physics. Derek stared at it for a full minute. "I'm not drinking that," he said out loud. The stream burbled in response, which streams shouldn't do unless they have opinions about things. Derek returned to his habitat, filtered some moisture from the air instead, which tasted like sadness and metal, and contemplated his survival strategy. The problem, he realized, was that he'd been thinking about this all wrong. Everyone who'd tried to colonize Infernus 7 had brought massive equipment, sophisticated technology, and detailed plans. They'd tried to control the planet, to bend it to their will, to create isolated pockets of civilization in the middle of chaos. And they'd all died. Derek had barely functional equipment, technology that was already breaking, and his plan consisted of try not to die. He couldn't control anything. He could barely control his own habitat. But maybe, he thought, that was the point. "Computer," he said into his comm unit, "pull up files on the local ecosystem." "Oh, we're doing research now. How academic." "Yes. Infernus 7 has a fascinating ecosystem that seems to operate on principles that violate several laws of thermodynamics. For instance, just give me the basics." "Well, the planet has carnivorous flora, fauna, and geology. The food chain is less a chain and more a circular firing squad where everything eats everything else. There's also a fungal network that covers approximately 60% of the planet's surface and seems to possess something resembling collective intelligence, though it mostly uses this intelligence to be really annoying." "What do the local life forms eat?" "Each other, mostly, although there are some plants that photosynthesize, using the planet's electromagnetic radiation instead of light, which is why they glow in the dark and also why they're slightly radioactive." Derek had an idea. It was a stupid idea. The kind of idea that would make any sensible person question his sanity. But Derek had stopped being sensible somewhere around the moment he'd quit his job to sign up for a reality show without reading the fine print. He spent the rest of day 2 collecting samples. Bits of the carnivorous plants, carefully extracted while the plants tried to extract bits of him. Samples of the glowing vegetation, some of the purple stream water stored in a container he hoped wouldn't dissolve. Pieces of the fungal network that covered most surfaces, which tried to colonize his gloves the moment he touched it. By nightfall, Derek had assembled what he proudly called his definitely going to kill me collection. "Computer," he said, "can the food synthesizer process local organic matter?" "Technically, yes, but that's not recommended because..." "Great." Derek fed samples into the food synthesizer, which made sounds like it was deeply offended by what he was asking it to do. The machine churned word and eventually produced something that looked like food, in the same way that a car accident looks like modern art. He stared at it. It stared back, possibly because it had developed eyes, though that might have been his imagination. "This is stupid," Derek said. He took a bite. It tasted like nothing he'd ever experienced, which made sense because it was made from nothing anyone had ever eaten. It was simultaneously bitter, sweet, savory, and something that didn't exist in human flavor vocabulary. His body's immediate response was to reject it entirely. Derek forced himself to swallow. He waited to die. He waited for the horrible poisoning, the organ failure, the mutation into something with too many arms, or whatever creative death in Furnace 7 had planned for him. Nothing happened. Well, nothing bad happened. He actually felt better, more energized, more alert. His headache from the atmosphere's weird pressure went away. "Computer!" Derek shouted. "I just ate local vegetation, and I'm not dead." "What? That's impossible. The local flora is incredibly toxic to most known life forms. You should be experiencing liver failure right now." "Well, I'm not. I feel great." There was a pause from the computer, the electronic equivalent of someone frantically checking their notes. "This is highly irregular. No previous colonization attempt has successfully consumed local organic matter. The Krylothians tried and immediately exploded. Not metaphorically, actually exploded." Derek looked at his collection of local samples with new appreciation. If he could eat the local vegetation, he didn't need food supplies from Earth. If the local ecosystem could sustain him, he didn't need to maintain a completely isolated environment. He just needed to adapt. Over the next several days, Derek developed what could generously be called a system, and more accurately called organized chaos held together by stubbornness. He expanded his food experiments, discovering that the carnivorous plants were actually delicious if you cooked them before they tried to eat you back. The glowing vegetation made an excellent garnish and also worked as emergency lighting. The fungal network, when properly processed, tasted exactly like mushrooms, which made sense because it was mushrooms. Just mushrooms with ideas about their place in the world. His habitat remained barely functional, but Derek stopped trying to repair it to Earth standards. Instead, he reinforced it with local materials, branches from the carnivorous trees, which stopped trying to eat him once he'd eaten enough of them that they apparently decided he wasn't worth the effort. Crystallized minerals from the toxic stream, which turned out to be excellent insulators. Even some of the fungal network, which he convinced to grow around his habitat instead of through it, by offering it regular samples of his food scraps. "You're negotiating with fungus?" the computer said, horrified. "It's working, isn't it?" Derek replied, watching as the fungal network created what was essentially a secondary wall around his habitat, one that actually helped regulate temperature and filter out the worst of the atmospheric toxins. By day 10, Derek had a routine. Wake up, check for things that had tried to eat the habitat overnight, collect food samples, avoid the gravity fluctuations during mid-morning, process lunch, experiment with new ways to not die, process dinner, update his log, sleep, repeat. His daily logs had become increasingly casual. Day 7 discovered that the shadow creatures are actually kind of shy. If you yell at them, they leave you alone. Also, they apparently don't like the color blue, which is weird but useful. Made a soup from 3 different types of carnivorous plants. It was either the best thing I've ever eaten or the toxins are affecting my taste buds. Don't care. It was delicious. Day 8. The gravity did this weird thing where everything floated for like 20 minutes. Managed to relocate my habitat's water storage tank to the roof during this time, which was lucky because I definitely couldn't have lifted it normally. The purple stream tried to follow me home today. Streams shouldn't be able to do that, told it to go away. It listened. This planet is so weird. Day 9. Something howled outside my habitat all night. Went out to investigate with a flashlight and a large stick. Found out it was one of those death worms the computer mentioned. Turns out they're only called death worms because they look scary. Actually pretty chill if you don't bother them. Fed it some food scraps. It seemed happy. Named it Gerald, after Gerald from accounting. Both are worm-like and slightly annoying, but ultimately harmless. Back in the Universal Broadcasting Network's headquarters, executive producer Velmora Chint was having what could politely be called a crisis, and more accurately called a complete mental breakdown. "He's still alive," she shouted at her monitor, all 7 eye stalks focused on the feed from Infernus 7. "It's been 10 days and he's still alive. How is he still alive?" The ratings board showed numbers that Velmora had never seen before. The show had gone viral, massively viral. Everyone across the galaxy was watching the human who somehow wasn't dying on the deadliest planet in known space. The betting pool had collapsed on day 4, when Derek survived his first full gravity fluctuation. The office coffee fund had been raided to start a new betting pool on what would eventually kill him. Current favorite was probably nothing at this rate, which was making people very upset because nobody had actually bet on that option. "Get me the xenobiology department," Velmora demanded. "I want to know how this is possible." The xenobiology department sent over Dr. Clinth Varos, a Zephonian whose species was known for their analytical minds and tendency to overthink literally everything. Dr. Varos watched 3 days' worth of footage from Infernus 7, taking copious notes that mostly consisted of the word "what" written over and over again in increasingly large letters. "This defies everything we know about human biology," Dr. Varos announced. "Humans are fragile. They need specific atmospheric conditions, specific nutrition, specific everything. This human is eating carnivorous plants and getting healthier." "So, what's your professional opinion?" Velmora asked. "My professional opinion is that either our understanding of human biology is completely wrong, or this specific human is some kind of mutant, or—" Dr. Varos paused, checking his notes again. "Or the planet itself is somehow adapting to him instead of him adapting to it, which makes no sense, but would explain why the fungal network seems to be helping him instead of converting him into mushrooms like it did to the last 17 colonization attempts." "The planet is helping him. I don't have a better explanation. Look at this footage from yesterday. He's walking through what should be a lethal fungal bloom, and they're just parting around him like he's some kind of chosen one, except he's clearly not, because he keeps tripping over things and complaining about his boots." They watched more footage. Derek arguing with a carnivorous tree about whether it could eat his trash. Derek feeding Gerald the death worm. Derek building what appeared to be a primitive shower system using toxic stream water that he'd somehow convinced to flow in directions water should not flow. "This is incredible," Velmora whispered. "This is impossible. This is the best ratings we've had in 12 years. "Should we send him help?" Dr. Varos asked. "Additional supplies? Better equipment?" "Are you insane? He's doing fine with broken equipment and improvisation. If we send him good equipment, he might actually succeed. And then what? We'd have to admit that a random human with no training colonized a planet that destroyed 3,000 other attempts. Do you know what that would do to galactic civilization? Do you know how many species would have existential crises? Dr. Varos considered this. That's actually a fair point. Do we watch, Velmora decided. We document. And we pray to whatever gods are listening that he doesn't somehow terraform the entire planet by accident, because at this rate, nothing would surprise me. Day 15 arrived with Derek waking up to find that Gerald had brought friends. 3 more deathworms had appeared overnight, apparently drawn by the regular food supply and the fact that Derek's habitat was now the safest place on the entire planet, because the fungal network had decided he was interesting and was keeping other threats away. "Morning, Gerald," Derek said, tossing food scraps to the worms. "Morning, Gerald 2, Gerald 3, and Gerald 4. He'd run out of creative names. The worms burbled contentedly, which was their version of wagging tails. Derek had discovered they were actually quite useful. They ate most things that tried to approach the habitat with hostile intent, and their burrows helped aerate the soil, which was helping the local vegetation grow in less trying to murder everything patterns and more normal plant patterns. Derek checked his supply inventory. His earth food was running low, but he didn't need it anymore. He'd been living primarily on local vegetation for a week and felt better than he had in years. Apparently, carnivorous plants were excellent sources of protein and vitamins, though possibly not vitamins humans were supposed to have. But who was counting? His habitat had evolved into something that barely resembled its original design. The fungal network had created organic walls that were actually better insulators than the original materials. The carnivorous tree branches he'd used for reinforcement had taken root and were now growing, creating a sort of living framework that adapted to the gravity fluctuations better than any manufactured structure could. Derek stood outside his habitat, drinking his morning not-quite coffee made from ground-up local seeds that were probably not hallucinogenic, but made everything seem slightly more colorful, and looked at his reflection in a piece of polished metal he'd salvaged from the shuttle. He'd changed. His skin had developed a slight greyish tint, probably from exposure to the atmosphere. His hair had gotten longer and wilder. He'd lost weight but gained muscle from the constant physical activity of survival. He looked, he thought, like someone who'd been living on an alien planet for 2 weeks, which he had. "Computer," he said into his comm unit, "how are the viewers reacting?" "Oh, Derek, the viewers love you. You're a sensation. Fan clubs have formed. There's merchandise. Someone wrote a song about you called The Man Who Lived When He Should Have Died. It's quite catchy. That's a terrible song title. It's #1 on the galactic charts." Derek shook his head and smiled. He'd come here thinking he'd just survive 30 days, collect his money, and go home. But something had changed. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, really living, in a way he hadn't felt in years of fixing printers and explaining to people why they needed to update their passwords. Sure, everything on this planet was trying to kill him, but at least it was interesting about it. At least he woke up every day, not knowing what would happen. At least he felt alive. Day 20 arrived faster than Derek expected. He'd settled into his new existence with surprising ease. The planet that had seemed so hostile just 3 weeks ago now felt almost familiar. He knew which areas to avoid during gravity fluctuations. He knew which plants were edible and which ones would try to digest you from the inside out. He knew that the shadow creatures were actually pretty friendly if you offered them scraps of food, and that Gerald and the other worms were better security than any system the Universal Broadcasting Network could have provided. His habitat was no longer just a habitat. It was a home. Weird, probably against several building codes, and definitely not something that would pass any kind of safety inspection, but it was his. Derek was repairing a section of the fungal wall that had been damaged by an overly enthusiastic deathworm when his comm unit crackled to life. "Derek Pemberton!" came Velmora's voice, slightly panicked. We have a situation. Is it worse than living on a planet that wants to eat me? Derek asked, not looking up from his work. We're sending you help. Derek stopped working. What? Assistance. Other colonists from various species across the galaxy. They're coming to help you establish a proper colony. I don't need help. I'm doing fine. Derek, you don't understand. Your success has caused a crisis. 37 different species are demanding the chance to colonize Infernus 7 now that you've proven it's possible. We've selected representatives from 6 different civilizations to join you. They'll arrive in 3 days. Derek looked around at his weird, chaotic, barely functional but somehow working colony. He looked at the Geralds, who were happily munching on something that had tried to attack the habitat last night. He looked at the fungal network, which had grown decorative patterns along the walls that almost looked intentional. He looked at the carnivorous trees, which had stopped trying to eat him and now just kind of existed alongside him in a peaceful truce. Tell them not to come, Derek said. What? I said, tell them not to come. I don't need help. I've got this. Derek, this is a tremendous opportunity. Think of what you could accomplish with proper support, advanced technology, scientific expertise. Velmora, Derek said patiently, every single colonization attempt before me brought advanced technology and scientific expertise. They all died. I brought broken technology and zero expertise, and I'm thriving. Maybe that should tell you something. There was a long pause. Derek could practically hear Velmora's brain trying to process this logic. But the ratings, she finally wailed. The drama of multiple species working together. The conflict when their different approaches clash. Not my problem. You wanted someone to colonize this planet? I'm colonizing it. You didn't say anything about playing nice with others. Derek turned off the comm unit before Velmora could respond. 3 days later, despite Derek's objections, 6 aliens arrived. The shuttle landed with significantly more grace than Derek's had, which immediately annoyed him. Out stepped representatives from 6 different species, each bringing equipment that made Derek's supplies look like garbage, which they kind of were. First came Ambassador Threndil, the same jellyfish creature who'd interviewed Derek. He was followed by a Krylothian scientist named Dr. Vrix, who stood approximately 8 feet tall and had way too many arms. Next was a Graxian engineer called Plix, who looked like someone had combined a hedgehog with a vacuum cleaner. Then came a Valorian combat specialist named Kenth, because apparently they thought combat would help on a planet where everything was already hostile. Fifth was a Jakar botanist, Mirana, who appeared to be made entirely of plant matter herself. And finally, a Zephonian analyst named Tycho, who immediately began taking measurements of things that didn't need measuring. They looked at Derek. Derek looked at them. So, Derek said, who wants to explain why you're here despite me specifically saying not to come? We're here to help, Threndil announced, his tentacles waving enthusiastically. To apply our combined knowledge and expertise to... He paused, looking at Derek's habitat. Is that structure made of fungus? Partially, Derek said. Also, carnivorous trees and some stuff I salvaged from my shuttle. It works. It shouldn't work, Doctor. Rick said, his many arms gesticulating wildly. The structural integrity alone should... He stopped, noticing the Geralds. Are those death worms? Yeah, that's Gerald. Gerald 2, Gerald 3, and Gerald 4. They're friendly. Friendly? Death worms are never friendly. They're named death worms for a reason. Well, these ones are. Probably because I feed them. Derek shrugged. Look, I'm sure you all brought impressive equipment and fancy plans, but I'm telling you right now, they won't work. Won't work, Plix said, his vacuum cleaner nose quivering with indignation. I'll have you know I've brought state-of-the-art atmospheric processors that can what? Control the atmosphere? Good luck with that. This planet does what it wants. You can either work with it or die trying to control it. The aliens exchanged glances that clearly said, this human has lost his mind. Derek, Threndil said carefully. "We appreciate your survival instincts, but we have centuries of combined experience in dying on this planet, apparently. 3,849 attempts, 0 successes, until me. Maybe consider that my approach, as stupid as it looks, is working better than centuries of experience." Kenth, the combat specialist, stepped forward. He was built like someone had tried to design the concept of intimidating in physical form. Human. I've survived situations that would make your worst nightmares look like pleasant dreams. I assure you, we know what we're... A shadow creature emerged from behind Derek's habitat. Kenth immediately drew a weapon that looked like it could destroy a small building. "Wait!" Derek shouted. Too late. Kenth fired. The energy blast hit the shadow creature, which absorbed the energy, grew twice as large, and made a sound like reality itself was offended. "Don't shoot them!" Derek yelled. "They respond to aggression! You just made it angry!" The shadow creature lunged at Kenth, who suddenly looked significantly less confident. Derek sighed, walked over and yelled at the shadow creature in what had become his standard approach. "Hey, knock it off! He's stupid, but he's with me!" The shadow creature paused, looked at Derek, looked at Kenth, then slowly retreated back into the darkness, grumbling in whatever language shadow creatures grumbled in. Kenth stared at Derek. "You talk to it?" "Yeah. They're pretty reasonable if you're not trying to kill them. Unlike some people." Derek glared at the combat specialist. The aliens began unloading their equipment, ignoring Derek's advice, because of course they did. Dr. Vrix set up a research station with sensors that immediately went haywire from the planet's electromagnetic field. Plix activated his atmospheric processors, which worked perfectly for approximately 90 seconds before something in the atmosphere caused them to start producing breathable air mixed with what smelled like rotten eggs. Mirana tried to plant Earth-compatible crops in specially treated soil, only to watch in horror as the local fungal network immediately invaded and converted them into something that glowed purple and whistled. "This is impossible," Dr. Vrix shouted, watching his equipment malfunction for the 5th time. "The readings don't make sense. Atmospheric composition keeps changing. Gravity fluctuates randomly. How are you surviving this?" Derek, who was feeding Gerald, looked over. "I stopped trying to make it make sense. I just deal with whatever happens." "That's not science. That's just chaos." "Yeah, well, chaos is working better than science so far." By nightfall of their first day, the aliens had managed to break 3 pieces of expensive equipment, accidentally anger a carnivorous tree that was now actively throwing rocks at Plix, discover that their pre-packaged food tasted terrible compared to Derek's local cuisine, nearly get eaten by something that emerged from the ground because they'd set up their camp in an area Derek had specifically said was probably where something lives, and generally proved that expertise was no match for practical experience. Derek made dinner using local ingredients. The aliens watched suspiciously as he prepared something that looked like it might be food, but could also have been an art project gone wrong. "What is that?" Mirana asked, her leaf-like face expressing what might have been horror or hunger. It was hard to tell with plant-based species. "Grilled carnivorous plant stalks with a sauce made from fermented fungus and those glowing berries from the whistling plants. It's actually pretty good." "You're eating local vegetation?" Threndil's tentacles recoiled. "That's suicide. I've been eating it for 3 weeks. I feel great." Derek took a bite. "Better than I've felt in years, honestly." The alien stared at him like he'd just announced he could fly by thinking happy thoughts. "The human's physiology must have mutated," Dr. Vrix said, scanning Derek with a device that beeped disapprovingly. "That's the only explanation. His cellular structure has been altered by exposure to..." The scanner made a sound like it was giving up. "I don't know what it's been altered by, but something." "Or," Derek suggested, "maybe humans are just more adaptable than you thought. Did you consider that?" They had not considered that. Over the next several days, Derek watched the aliens struggle with everything he'd learned to handle easily. They tried to build structures that immediately collapsed or got eaten by the environment. They attempted to establish proper protocols for dealing with local fauna, which the fauna completely ignored. They brought in sophisticated equipment that the planet seemed to take personal offense to, causing it to malfunction in increasingly creative ways. Derek, meanwhile, continued his routine. Wake up, feed the Geralds, check the fungal walls, collect food, avoid the mid-morning gravity fluctuations, and generally exist in harmony with a planet that everyone else insisted should be killing him. The aliens began to notice something strange. The areas around Derek's habitat were becoming less hostile. The carnivorous plants in his vicinity had stopped trying to eat everything and had started just growing normally. The ground was more stable. Even the shadow creatures seemed calmer, content to exist nearby without bothering anyone. "It's like the planet likes him," Mirana observed, watching as Derek convinced a particularly aggressive fungal growth to relocate by offering it better soil conditions elsewhere. "Planets don't like people," Dr. Vrix insisted. "That's anthropomorphization of geological and biological processes that—" He stopped because Derek had just walked through what should have been a lethal acid mist and emerged completely unharmed. "Okay, that shouldn't be possible." Tycho, the analyst, had been quietly taking notes the entire time. On day 25, he approached Derek while the others were dealing with yet another equipment malfunction. "I've been analyzing the patterns," Tycho said. "The planet isn't adapting to you. You're adapting to IT, but not just physically. You're thinking like the planet, chaotically, without trying to impose order. The others, they're trying to make Infernus 7 behave like the planets they know. You're just accepting it for what it is." Derek considered this while repairing a section of fungal wall that Gerald had accidentally damaged. Yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, back on Earth, I spent 10 years trying to make technology work the way it was supposed to work. It never did. People broke it, or used it wrong, or it just spontaneously decided to malfunction because Tuesdays are apparently cursed. Coming here and dealing with a planet that also doesn't follow the rules? It's actually kind of familiar. You're comparing Infernus 7 to IT support. They're both chaotic systems that resist logical solutions and will kill you if you're not careful. The main difference is the planet is more honest about wanting to kill you. Tycho made a note. "That's actually the most insightful thing I've heard all week." Day 28 arrived with an unexpected development. The planet had been relatively calm by its standards for almost a week. Derek had started to think that maybe, just maybe, they'd all survived to day 30 without major incident. Then the ground opened up, not metaphorically, literally opened up. A massive chasm appeared approximately 50 yards from the aliens' camp, and from that chasm emerged something that made all previous threats look like mild inconveniences. It was huge, easily the size of a building. It had too many mouths, too many eyes, and too many appendages to count. It looked like what would happen if nightmares had nightmares, and those nightmares gained physical form. "What is that?" Kent screamed, which was not the confident combat specialist response anyone expected. "That," said Derek, who'd seen something similar emerge briefly on day 12 before retreating underground, "is probably what ate all the previous colonization attempts." The creature roared, and the sound was felt more than heard. It started moving toward the aliens' camp, crushing ground beneath it that had taken them days to stabilize. "Use the weapons!" Threndil shouted. "Defensive protocols, Alpha through Omega." Kent activated every weapon system they'd brought, energy weapons, kinetic weapons, something that looked like it weaponized mathematical concepts. The barrage hit the creature and accomplished absolutely nothing, except making it angrier. "Fall back!" Vrix yelled. "Retreat to the shuttles!" "No time!" Derek shouted. "It's between you and the shuttles. Everyone to my habitat. Now!" The aliens didn't argue. They ran. The Geralds, bless their simple worm hearts, tried to attack the creature and were casually swatted aside. The creature continued its advance, destroying everything in its path. They reached Derek's habitat just as the creature caught up. It loomed over them, multiple mouths opening to reveal teeth that Teeth had nightmares about. Derek stepped outside. "What are you doing?" everyone screamed. "Something really stupid or really brilliant," Derek shouted back. "I haven't decided which." He stood in front of the creature, which was now close enough that he could smell its breath, which smelled like death and disappointment. He didn't run. He didn't shoot at it. He just stood there. "Hey!" Derek yelled at the creature. "You're scaring my roommates!" The creature paused, which creatures of apocalyptic horror generally don't do. "Yeah, you," Derek continued, channeling every ounce of frustration from 10 years of dealing with difficult customers and broken technology. "I live here, me and the Geralds and the fungus and these idiots who won't listen to basic advice. This is my home. You don't get to just come up here and wreck it." The creature stared at Derek with too many eyes. Derek stared back with his standard issue 2 eyes, but significantly more audacity than sense. "I've been here for 4 weeks, Derek yelled. "I've eaten your plants. I've befriended your deathworms. I've made peace with your shadow creatures. I've convinced your fungus to help with construction. This planet and I have an understanding, so either eat me or go away, but stop destroying my stuff." There was a long moment where nothing happened. The creature continued to stare. Derek continued to stand his ground, despite every survival instinct screaming at him to run. Then the creature made a sound, not a roar. Something else. Something that might have been confusion. It looked at Derek. It looked at Derek's habitat, covered in fungal growth and carnivorous trees. It looked at the Geralds, slowly crawling back from where they'd been swatted. It looked at the whole chaotic, impossible colony Derek had created, and then it retreated back into the ground. Just like that, no dramatic battle, no last-minute save, it just leave. Derek stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Behind him, he could hear the aliens having various forms of breakdowns. "What?" Dr. Vrix finally managed. "Was that?" "I think," Derek said slowly, "I just had a HOA dispute with the planet's apex predator, and I won." Day 30 arrived with Derek feeling like he'd lived several lifetimes in a month. The aliens had spent the last 2 days in various states of shock, trying to understand how a human yelling at a monster had been more effective than their advanced weaponry. Velmora's voice came over the comm, more excited than Derek had ever heard her. "Derek Pemberton, you did it! 30 days! You've successfully colonized Infernus 7. "Yeah," Derek said, looking around at his weird little home. "I guess I did." "The galaxy is amazed. You're a hero. You've accomplished what thousands couldn't. You'll be famous, rich. You can go anywhere, do anything. So tell us, Derek, what will you do now? Return to Earth? Accept speaking engagements? Write a book?" Derek thought about it. He thought about going back to Earth, to cities and offices and people who couldn't figure out why their computer wouldn't work when it wasn't plugged in. He thought about the 50,000 credits he'd earned, which was apparently nothing compared to the merchandising deals and interview offers Velmora was telling him about. He looked at his habitat, at the Geralds, at the fungal walls that had somehow become more home than his apartment had ever been. He looked at the 6 aliens who were slowly learning to survive by watching him instead of relying on their expertise. "I'm staying," Derek said. "What?" "I'm staying. This is my home now. It's weird and chaotic and trying to kill me half the time, but it's my weird chaos. Back on Earth, I'd just end up fixing printers again. Here I'm actually living. But Derek, the money, the fame, the don't need it. Well, I'll take the money, that's useful. But the rest, keep it. Send anyone who wants to join the colony, but tell them, don't bring fancy equipment. Don't bring detailed plans. Just bring stubbornness and a willingness to adapt. That's all you need here." "You're insane," Velmora said, though she sounded more impressed than critical. "Probably," Derek agreed, "but I'm insane in a place where that's actually an advantage." He looked up at the sky, which was currently the color of a bruise trying to become a sunset. In the distance, something howled. Gerald howled back, which was weirdly comforting. The fungal network pulsed with bioluminescence as night approached. Besides, Derek added, almost to himself, I finally found a job where nobody calls me about their damn printer breaking. And really, wasn't that worth more than all the fame in the galaxy?